Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. I'm your host, Steve BERG. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Lytical Ventures. Lytical Ventures focuses on early-stage investments of companies that drive corporate intelligence. Corporate intelligence includes, for example, cybersecurity, data and analytics, and artificial intelligence. You can find us at www.lyticalventures.com. Lytical is spelled Lytical, Ventures, all one word, .com. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. We have a new production partner this season, VC Careers. If you're looking for a job in venture capital, join over 8,000 VCs and VC job hunters on John Gannon's VC Jobs email list. Visit johngannonblog.com/intangibles to learn more and to subscribe. Also, please find Intangibles on its new home on the web, www.intangiblespodcast.com. There are only two ways to live your life. One is though nothing is a miracle. The other is though everything is a miracle. Albert Einstein said this. How can anything be a miracle unless we notice it? How can we notice something if we don't focus our attention on it? How can we focus our attention unless we are mindful? If Albert Einstein is right, then there are a lot of miracles most of us are missing out on. My guest today is going to help us all notice, at least a little bit better, the miracles that we are surrounded by. He's a longtime student of mindfulness. Joe Burton is the first founder that has ever been on the podcast. His company is called Whil, and he will tell us more about it in a second. In addition, Joe and I have been friends since sometime in the early 90s, so it's that much greater of a pleasure to speak with him. I'm not going to give you his background as I normally do, because when he provides it, you will see why it is the perfect explanation for why he found mindfulness and then became a mindfulness founder. I will tell you that Joe is the author of a new book called Creating Mindful Leaders. And as many of you know, mindfulness has, through multiple guest references, become a hot topic on the Intangible podcast recently. Let me welcome Joe Burton. Joe, as I mentioned, it's a great pleasure to talk to you.
Steve, it's so great to hear your voice. I'm happy to be here.
We've had probably, I'd say 15 podcast guests of the 25 or 30 in total that have come on to talk about some other soft skill. And then they all casually mention the contribution that mindfulness makes to strengthening that other skill. So let's start with the idea that this audience is sold on the value of mindfulness. And let's talk about what it actually is and the way it can improve what leaders do. However, before we do that, would you kindly give a little background on yourself and what brought you to mindfulness?
Sure, absolutely. I think the short answer of what brought me to mindfulness is back pain, crisis, anger management, stress, insomnia. So I started my career early on in Price Waterhouse, which is now PwC, and love the up or out culture, working around the clock and so forth, and then progressed into my career into entertainment and into advertising and into public company life, and was lucky enough to become a global COO in a division of a public company. So we had about 50,000 employees around the world, and I spent most of my time, probably 70%, traveling, working 14-hour days, wearing stress as a badge of honor. And then, Steve, as you know, my late 30s, things started catching up with me. I had herniated 2 discs in my back, and suffered from about 8 years of chronic back pain. Did that again in my early 40s, and at the same time, we're dealing with the stresses of public company life, the stresses of managing chronic back pain that turned into insomnia, that turned into asthma. And then I lost two sisters, one to drugs, and then my twin sister to suicide. So here I was, really just dealing with, more stress than the average bear, and it wasn't going well for my body. So I turned to mindfulness really out of desperation. It was that or spinal fusion in terms of managing pain and all the other issues that went along with it. So a lot of people come in that way when they're sort of in trouble. And, for me, I'm just grateful that I found these techniques.
And you were a skeptic, right? I mean, you're like, no, this is not for me.
Oh, yeah. Are you kidding me? As a COO, my doctor was recommending meditation. I was like, are you crazy? What if somebody found out? That's where I was coming from. And, type A personality in a public company. And, fast forward now, I started Whil a little over 3.5 years ago. And mindfulness is in the conversation pretty much everywhere. I think about almost half of the Fortune 500 are now running programs of some sort or another to help employees manage largely what I was dealing with, which is an increasing amount of stress and a decreasing amount of, good health and happiness.
Okay. Let me dig in a little bit further on the specifics. It seemed like a rudimentary question, but what's the difference between meditation and mindfulness? Can you really have one without the other?
You can. And I like to think of meditation as sort of practice. There are dozens and dozens of techniques you can use to calm and focus the mind and relax the central nervous system. So meditation is one, and most people recognize meditation as focusing on one thing, in this case, your breath, for a prolonged period of time, and basically training your brain to focus, right? Engage one part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. Notice when you're distracted, by the normal ruminations of the mind. Catch yourself and then come back to focus on the breath. So meditation's a favorite form of practicing to train the brain. There are dozens and dozens of other techniques, right? Reading is great. Poetry is great. Yoga is great. Journaling, sitting and listening to another person is a form of practice. So we go through a lot of this within our training. All of that is, how do you train the brain to focus on one thing at a time? So meditation is one of many forms. It's a fan favorite, if you will. And mindfulness is, I like to think of mindfulness as game day. How do you apply all that you've learned into your relationships, into your meetings, into how you interact with your spouse or your child? Are you able to focus and enjoy music, art, whatever it is you're doing in the moment, right? So think of meditation as one form of practice and mindfulness as applying that practice.
That's pretty helpful. So I think many people listening have been through a guided meditation, but in case they haven't, could you talk us through the parameters of what your normal daily meditation is like? And if you want to put that in the context of Whil, I think that would be helpful also.
Sure. So first, Whil is the name of my company. It's WHIL. And I started it about 3.5 years ago. Prior to that, I helped create a consumer app called Headspace, which has been a big hit with consumers. And my personal practice is I like to kick off the day with a short practice, usually around 5 or 10 minutes. I focus on things like intention, gratitude, what is most important to me at any particular time. That sort of calms the mind and gets me focused for the day. At 3 o'clock every day at Whil, our team comes together for a guided mindfulness meditation practice. So we have a practice room here at our offices in San Francisco, and we go through our content. So, for example, this week is self-awareness. One of our programs is the famous Search Inside Yourself program that was created at Google. So we have the digital version of that program. And this week we're cycling through, that. So it's one session a day, 5 or 10 minutes. And then we have a discussion after that. And the discussion is largely around, so when it comes to the self-awareness example, how do we apply this? How can we become more self-aware? How do these tools and techniques impact our relationships and how we do business together? And, so that moves from just a personal practice to how can we impact our team and our culture and what we're doing together.
So I love that you obviously are, I can just see everyone walking into the room at 3:00 at the company. I think that's fantastic. Just aside, when I've done guided meditations, I always kind of wait until the middle or the afternoon of the day because I figure like, oh, I'm wound up. This is a chance for me to ground. But I noticed you start out in the morning. Is there a particular reason for that?
Yeah, there is. Almost everything that we do, we've got about 250 programs, about 1,500 sessions now. And they're all based in science. And so when it comes to a morning practice, particularly around gratitude, the Mayo Clinic has done a lot of research around the benefit of gratitude and positivity. And in running a startup, which is a high stress proposition, starting the day with gratitude is a great way to think about all the things that are going right instead of all of the challenges that we face day in and day out. And so I like to start that way each day, to sort of clear the mind and get ready for game time. And then you're right, towards the afternoon, it's great to take that break, get a little boost of energy, relax the mind, and then get back at it. Mm.
How much does consistency matter in the practice of mindfulness?
Yeah, I think it's like anything else. If you think about training the brain as like any other muscle, I'd say 5 or 10 minutes a day on a fairly regular basis is helpful. That's where most scientific research kicks in to show like, oh, this actually starts to change the makeup of the brain, how neural pathways connect, the ability to be focused, and so forth. As you're going into this, one of the benefits is also not just sort of breathing if you're using meditation as a form of practice, but deep breathing has been shown to have tremendous impacts on the cardiovascular system. The ability to relax the central nervous system is as important as being able to focus the mind. And so you get those benefits by making it a normal part of your routine. So I recommend to be able, fit it in 3 to 4 times a week if you can, every day, if you really want to get the greatest benefits. And more and more research is showing small breaks throughout the day have tremendous benefit. Everyone's suffering from stress, anxiety, constant worry. The numbers are all going the wrong way when it comes to that and depression. And these breaks, especially for folks who are working 10 or 12 hours a day, which is becoming more and more the norm, these small breaks throughout the course of the day, even if it's a minute or two here and there, can have tremendous impact on resetting the system.
I had Dan Pink on the podcast a month or two ago, and he was advocating the very same thing, that the small breaks throughout the day allow a kind of a mental reset. So you mentioned connections within the brain. Is that neuroplasty? Is that the same thing?
It is. So this idea of the brain is kind of like plastic, where depending upon how you use it, you actually change the form and makeup of the brain, and you change how neural connections are made. So neural connections are basically, electric energy in the brain. They can track this these days through oxygenated hemoglobin, like where oxygen goes in the brain is where the brain's focus and energy is going. And there's been a ton of research, going back to in the 1906, a famous Spanish neuroanatomist, Ramon y Cajal, was the first to start dissecting brains and doing hand-drawn images of the brains, mapping neural connections, if you can imagine. So even back then, he came up with this postulate of anyone, if they chose, could be the architect of their mind. This idea of your brain develops based on how you use it. And then, most people know Donald Hebbian theory, 40 years later came up with this concept of neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So we get better at the things we do most. And that's awesome, if you're using the brain like, I'm here in San Francisco, Steph Curry, is training to shoot 3-pointers all day long to the point where he can do it without even thinking about it. The brain takes over, right? Or Itzhak Perlman, can play a mean violin without even thinking about it because he's practiced so much. Those neural pathways are there. The problem for most of us is what are we practicing? We're practicing constant distraction with technology and worry and anxiety and insomnia, and the brain gets better and better at processing those negative thoughts. So I'll be happy to go more into the science around that, but there's some fascinating studies confirming we're actually training ourselves to be, experts, ninjas, Olympic gold medalists in the wrong things when it comes to brain health.
So I think we should plug the book, because I recommend that people go in and read all the science that you've put in the book. It's just chock full of stuff. So we'll mention at the end, and I mentioned in the intro, there's two parts of meditation that stand out for me. And, as you discussed them, the breathing and labeling of thoughts. If you wouldn't mind digging a little bit, particularly on these topics as they relate to focus.
Sure. So I think breath work, or focusing on your breath, is probably one of the most popular forms of training, so of meditation. And it's great because this is something that's always with you. And, so focusing on the breath as one thing to train your attention on, and then training the brain to notice when you're distracted, and then coming back to focus on your breath, right? So what does distraction mean? That's when, as you're meditating, breathing in, breathing out, listening to a guided meditation, the brain will go into worry about the future or about the past, a little conspiracy theory. Is somebody out to get me? What's my boss thinking now? What's going on with my spouse? And these little distractions are the brain doing what it does, which is revisit, these ruminations on a regular basis. So by noticing that and dismissing it and coming back to focus on one thing at a time, you're training the brain to do exactly that. Notice when you're distracted and come back to a single point of focus. Now, the second part you asked about is this idea of labeling is fantastic for a variety of things. You can label your emotions, you can label the thoughts and dismiss them as you're having a meditation or a mindfulness practice. And the beauty of doing this is simply by stopping to label something, you're engaging the thinking brain, right? So usually when we're anxious or worried about something, the amygdala, the emotional brain, is taking over. So we're thinking about, what could go wrong? What if that went wrong? What's going to happen in the future? Simply stopping yourself to label that, to say like, oh, I'm experiencing anxiety right now, helps you to think about and engage, the prefrontal cortex. What's going on? Why am I feeling this? Is this risk happening right now? Should I be worried about this? How can I address it? So you move from the emotional worry, where we all get stuck in these loops without even realizing it, and the brain gets better and better at repeating those loops, to disrupting that loop and engaging the thinking brain, just to say, oh, that's not happening right now. Let me dismiss that and come back to what is happening right now. And, these two basic techniques of noticing when you're distracted, dismissing it, and coming back to a single point of focus is super helpful, right? Not only for business and productivity, which is, it's like magic, but for our health. Because in the absence of that, we get stuck in these emotional ruminations where I like to use the analogy, imagine your brain is like a refrigerator, and, we chock it full of good stuff and then we leave the door open. So the equipment's running constantly to the point where it breaks down and what's inside is not very good. So these two practices are great to notice, like, oh, the door's open, the equipment's running, let me close that and focus on what's happening right now. It's a great way to take better care of your mental and emotional health.
I've always wondered about that, why you don't do anything, right? Because the type A personality in me wants to run that to a logical conclusion. But now I know that just leaving it alone, not doing anything, is the better way to kind of clear the decks. So you mentioned a bunch of, or at least in passing, the discussion of physiological benefits to mindfulness. I saw in the book there's a list of them, and I wondered, I'm going to read that list. I wondered if, when you hear that, if there's any particular ones that you want to comment on. I think that would be helpful. So As I read it, mindfulness is good for concentration and focus, which we talked about, fewer triggers, which could be an interesting one, reduce of chronic stress, which you mentioned was one of the things that brought you here, reduction in pain, strengthening of immunity, lower blood pressure, increased happiness, improved cardiovascular health, better sleep, and reduced error rate. I mean, it feels very panacea-esque, and I know you've cautioned against that, but wow, that's an amazing list. What in particular jumps out to you?
Well, I think, for me, and I go back to why I got into a mindfulness practice to start, it's, I'm a, and we've known each other for a very long time. We're both kind of driven type A personalities. And I had a major blind spot, and that was, as a global COO, managing 8 years of chronic back pain, leading to 5 years of insomnia, leading to asthma and my body just starting to fall apart. I had this blind spot. I didn't even realize, all of this is affecting my ability to be able to focus, be nice, stay calm under pressure, right? And, so you kind of, over the course of time, when you're under this kind of stress, you sort of turn into a different person, right? So we all have this desired way of being, like, I'm going to be a, fun, engaging leader, right? And then you end up over the course of time turning into this, like, I'm going to be distracted, angry, and frustrated.
Yeah.
So we don't plan on it, right? And so that's what really pops for me is like, what if you can look at yourself and say, how do I want to be? And separately, how am I actually showing up, and be honest about it? That's where the science resonated with me, in that, I didn't want to hear about any of this stuff. Like, are you kidding me? Meditation, what a bunch of hippy-dippy, woo-woo, touchy-feely stuff. That's not for me. But when I started getting into the science, which is some of the studies that you're quoting, I was like, oh, wow, there's numbers behind this and research and normal people doing it and more CEOs embracing it. And I came around the hard way, right? Anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm going to point people back. Creating mindful leaders, you got to go read the science in here. It really is amazing. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's been a number of people, guests that have come on the podcast and mentioned mindfulness. Not coincidentally, you mentioned a number of these same topics in your book. I'm going to surface a couple of these topics and maybe let you riff on them a little bit, and if you'd be willing to do that. The first one, communication and mindful listening, which, by the way, I think are way harder than people think they are.
Oh, absolutely. So this, one of the biggest issues we find in business is, when we work with about 225 companies around the world, we've got about 2 million users. And the norm, right, is people say like, our work culture is pretty tough, right? And if they're being really honest, oftentimes they'll say our work culture is toxic, right? So people are stressed. We have this commanding work culture, and we're not communicating very well. And over the course of time, what we find in the science, and if you've read Daniel Kahneman's great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, most of us train ourselves over the course of time not to listen. We train ourselves to respond. In other words, I want to jump ahead. I want to get the answer in. I want to talk over you. I want to show that I'm smart, and so forth. And while some of this comes out of insecurity, over the course of time, it actually becomes a practice where the brain takes over, the emotional brain, and you behave this way on a regular basis. And to further complicate that, there are lots of inner workings of the brain that I talk about in the book, like the average human being can speak at about 150 words per minute. Well, guess what? The average human being can process words at about 3,000 words per minute. So when it comes to communicating and listening, most of us are like bored out of our freaking minds. It's like, can you speak faster? I can process words 20 times faster than you can serve them up. And so this idea of mindful listening is, can you slow down and actually use another person as the sole focus of your attention and let them speak for 2 to 3 minutes uninterrupted? And so that is a game changer, practicing that to the point where it can become part of your normal routine. And then guess what? The folks on the other side feel heard, they feel respected, it reduces stress because it creates this space for conversation. And so it's, one of many, many techniques, but it's fantastic, especially for professionals who, just think to yourself, listener, when's the last time someone listened to you for 2 minutes without interrupting you? Like, it doesn't happen.
So that's fantastic, but I've got two immediate thoughts. The first one is Daniel Kahneman is constantly brought up almost as much as mindfulness, maybe second. So this group of listeners, they're Daniel Kahneman disciples as well. The second is I have listened to Ben Glowey, who's the sound editor of a podcast, edit some of the discussions. And he listens, I listen to an audio book or whatever at 1.5x or 2x. He listens to it at like 4 or 5x. And I'm like, you can hear that? And he's like, yes, of course, it's right here. So I've got visual evidence of the fact that people can actually process way faster than we can talk. Okay, the second one, concept, that I thought was just amazing, and I'm really interested in, is resilience. And I know that you're citing some work from Dr. Liz Stanley in your book, but the stuff about the zone of resilience and the place meditation in effective recovery plays is just fascinating. If you would comment on that, it'd be great.
Sure. So Dr. Stanley is one of my heroes. She's at Georgetown University, former military officer. And her, you can find her story online or her TED Talks, and you'll see why she's my hero. 3 active deployments in the military, hundreds of female troops under her watch. While she's dealing with active deployment, she's also dealing with the sexual harassment and abuse, and in some cases, rape of female military members under her command. And she takes this stuff head on. And she's also taking on the military intelligence and the stress of being in active combat to the point where her systems give out and she ultimately loses her eyesight for 3 months, right? And so as she tells the story, the doctors estimate that her system was just shutting down to avoid any more stimulus. Well, out of that, she ended up creating this wonderful organization called Mindfulness, or MFIT, for the military. And it's these form of mindfulness practices specifically for folks who have gone through combat or have PTSD, and just amazing. She's also done a whole body of research around resilience and this idea that in the same way that we're all training our brains all the time, we're all training our resilience. We're either increasing it or decreasing it all the time. And so the short of her research is, it's good to bump up against stress to the point where you expand your stress zone. How much can you take on? But you have to back off and recover. And of course, that's where mindfulness comes in. And this idea of constantly bump up against what you can take on and constantly back down to recover expands your zone of resilience. Now, the opposite is also true. If you do what I did, and I think most people do this, which is you run until you hit a wall, right? Until you herniate discs, until your insomnia is terrible, until your body's giving out, and then you take a short break, and then you get right back in there. Well, what happens is over the course of time, you shorten, like you reduce that zone of resilience, meaning you can take on less and less. And then the domino effect happens where most of us who hit a wall, it's like we take off a few weeks, get right back in there, and then sure enough, in a shorter period of time, you hit a wall again and you bounce back at a lower level. And then later you hit a wall again, you bounce back at yet a lower level of resilience. And so this, we cover this research within the book, but the thing I love about this is this notion of the routines that we put ourselves through day in and day out have a tremendous impact on our lives. So you're training your brain all the time, either in good ways or bad ways. You are creating routines in your life that either create good health and happiness or the reverse. And we're either expanding our zone of resilience or contracting it regularly, right? And all the numbers, as I say, are going the wrong way. These routines are catching up to us. And her research, I think, does a great job at explaining that.
Yeah, it is. It's fantastic. I think one thing that we would want to say, I think you would want to say, is that not all stress is actually bad, right? Maybe you could explain why we should develop a positive mindset towards at least certain kinds of stress.
Yeah, this was a big part of the learning for me, and I've dedicated probably about the last 8 years to really learning as much as I can about the brain science and in what we do in creating our training products at Whil. And there are basically two types of stress, and I'll oversimplify this, but one is eustress, which is a good form of stress, and that is where you're on edge, but you know you're ready, you're prepared, you know you can get through it. So, Stefano, you've been a runner over time, and you've done boxing and lots of different sports. And I was a basketball player and a baseball player, so we can flash back and remember those times of like, oh yeah, we had a big game or a big situation, and I knew I was ready, and things turned out well. So we have that energy, that nervous energy on the edge, and we can perform under pressure, right? So that's eustress. Distress is the opposite. It's when we have all of that nervous energy that turns into worry and anxiety because we're not ready, we're not prepared, okay? And in the same way with this sports analogy, where you can have good stress that allows you to perform and get through and win, or bad stress where you crack and fall or lose under pressure. The same is true in a business setting where, if you're ready for a meeting, if you're ready to manage your emotions, if you're ready to deal with conflict, and what we call, the Asians, innovation, globalization, mobilization, you name it, that's the norm today, right? So do you have the skills to deal with the norm and therefore thrive under pressure, or do you not, where you feel like you're being crushed under the pressure?
Yeah, and obviously very significant to be able to define, section off, understand, because there's a different response, as you suggest, to each kind. All right, look, I'm gonna hop forward a little bit. When you were discussing your practice about gratitude, I think you also mentioned something about gratitude journaling. And I know this isn't exactly like a clean segue, but it was something that I really wanted to get to before we ended up. Could you explain the interaction of mindfulness, gratitude, and then to the extent how you mix in gratitude journaling in your daily routine?
Sure. So the idea behind journaling, which was really interesting to me, like this is when I first found out about journaling, and people were like, "Oh, you should try journaling." I'm like, what am I, a teenage girl, right? That's not for grown men. And then I started getting into, lo and behold, there's science, there's actually evidence and testing behind this idea of slowing down, writing out your thoughts, being intentional about your planning, working through difficult emotions, and putting pen to paper. And they've actually done studies on cancer patients, recovering from cancer, have a much higher success rate of recovery when they're actually keeping journals, right? And their intentions to recover, and the routines, and working through the troubles and issues and their worries and so forth. And there have been studies on people who have been unemployed for long periods of time, right? And they take one group and say, we want you to journal and capture your ideas and your plans, being intentional about getting back to work. And the other group didn't. And what they found is the folks who journaled and were more intentional about their life and about their job search got employment 70% faster than folks who didn't. So the idea here, I think, from a gratitude perspective and connecting it to journaling, and you can do this with whatever is most important to you, is to be intentional about life, right? So, even 5 minutes of capturing your thoughts on what's troubling me, how can I work through that, and so forth. Too many of us make a practice of ruminating on the bad, of gossiping to the point where it becomes a hobby. And in a work setting, this idea of, people talk about like, oh, what I hate about our culture is blah, 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 right? And it turns into this sort of ongoing negativity where they invite other people in, like, woe is me, this place is terrible, right? but it doesn't have the release of resolution. And so journaling is how do you explore these issues in your life, but then the plan for resolution, the plan for a better way forward. And that's where we like to connect the dots, within our training, and you experience this within our training programs as well, is that is another form of mindfulness practice, right? Calm and focus the mind, be intentional about living, explore resolution against the issues you're facing.
Super helpful. Before I move on, I think this is connected, but if it's not, forgive me. Your quick thoughts on the value, especially for leaders, of forgiveness.
Yeah, so we have programs around this whole topic, and I think for any type A personality, the nature of working in a commanding work culture is, first up, you get caught up in this the idea, like management sometimes will talk about, like, what they want to be. Like, I'm a visionary, follow me, we're going to change the world, things are going to be great, da da da. But when people get stressed, they dip into this, commanding way of being that actually impacts and turns into a whole company culture, right? So if you're stuck in that, faster, cheaper, get it done, no excuses, ship the product, make the client happy, to the point where that becomes the entire culture, it ends up being like us against them, right? And mistakes aren't forgiven. And the idea behind forgiveness is a deep part of human relationships, right? Can I forgive you for things big and small? Can we have an open dialogue about those things, how they affect me, how they affect you, so that we can actually build on a foundation of trust and move forward and collaborate, versus trying to work together on a foundation of quicksand where I'm not trusted and everything about our day is do this, do that, or else. So that's a business example. And of course, we get into relationships with spouse and children, and making, forgiveness and saying, I'm sorry, and being grateful for relationships on a regular basis goes a very long way to removing these negative ruminations, to being caught up in, why I don't like someone, why I don't trust someone, and once again, the more we think about, or whatever it is we spend our time thinking about, occupies so much of our time, right? So forgiveness is a great way to clear the slate and think about better things and build good relationships.
And I think it's just so hard for your typical person, right? It's not necessarily built in to everybody from the beginning. And so kind of coming to this at some point in your life, understanding it in context, can be really important. All right. Last major topic I want to cover is emotional awareness. Mindfulness can aid one in recognizing their emotions and managing their emotions. I think that's correct. If you could, well, first of all, is it correct? And if you could elaborate on that process, I think that'd be really helpful.
Sure. So I think first, the 5 key areas of emotional intelligence that Dan Goleman researched in his famous book on emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation, understanding your motivations, empathy, and social skills, right? How we interact with people. And I think mindfulness is the foundation. And I like to use the analogy as you're walking upstairs or going up a ladder of skills. Mindfulness is the base of emotional intelligence, meaning I can be calm and focused, open and aware as a starting point. And this idea of emotional intelligence gets into starting with yourself and then moving into other relationships. So self-awareness, what am I good at? What am I not good at? Do I understand my own emotions and perspectives? Later we build into understanding other people's emotions and perspectives is really critical because most of us get caught up in this, the old way of working, like where am I in the pyramid? Who am I in charge of? And the way of working has changed so much that the old, like I'm the smartest and I'm in charge, I have a high IQ, is out the window. What companies are looking for more and more is emotional intelligence. Can you lead, inspire, motivate, connect, collaborate to drive teams to success. And that's the skill everyone is desperate for right now. And so when we think about emotional intelligence and these 5 areas, it's what Harvard Business Review calls the must-have skills for modern professionals. And I think that goes a long way. Early in my career, and this may resonate with you, growing up at PwC, there was no talk around this. It was like, hit your numbers, win a client, put in your hours, they better be billable. And if you do that, you can stay. If you don't, you can't. And that kind of behavior was rewarded, and that was the culture. Even PwC now, who is embracing mindfulness, years later, and is thankfully one of our clients, is bringing these practices in to create this sort of, what do we need for the next wave of professionals to deal with the norm? And the norm is, disruption, innovation, constant change, right? Deal with that. So that's what excites me about emotional intelligence. These are the skills for, the game has changed. Do you have the skills to play the new game?
Yeah. As I looked at it, the things that kind of caught me off guard, but also I thought were valuable with regard to emotional intelligence or emotional awareness, is that the more emotional aware you are, the more that influences your self-confidence. And the other one was that one can actively move from compulsion to choice, which gets back to the living a deliberate life. So that's what I picked out of it. All right. As a way to wrap things up, let's try to relate all this back to being a better founder. Is all of the value gained through mindfulness simply leading by example, or are there ways that folks can translate specific behaviors into a better corporate culture?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to, certainly leading by example is great, but for anyone who's read the Edelman Trust Survey, you'll recognize there are major issues in organizations. And so for the first time ever, in their new study, the vast majority of employees distrust the 4 forms of, of structure and infrastructure more than they trust it. So, government, the media, news, and company leadership, right, are included in that list. And so if your starting point is like, oh, things have changed, employees get more and more of their news through Slack channels and chat rooms, and they trust each other more than they trust management and a lot more than they trust the CEO, that's kind of a fact. And, if anyone hasn't read the Edelman Trust Survey, I encourage you to do it. You can get it online for free. So the way we've worked has changed. And more employees are looking for, and particularly in a startup culture, how do we work and collaborate together, create together? And that does have to translate into specific behaviors, right? So being more open, transparent, trusting, managing conflict, and training people on this idea that conflict and stress can be good if we access it in the right way, right? If we have the right skills to be curious, open, non-judgmental, kind, collaborative, and so forth. And so these kind of behaviors are what we are training as default modes. In the absence of that, to the listener, what are you training yourself in regularly? Is it conflict, conspiracy theories, second guessing, and how does that affect your own confidence and your team confidence, right? So we found more and more in the research is, whatever you're practicing daily creates a cycle that is either positive and brings people along to that positivity, or is negative and invites people into that negativity.
I think it was you guys who did this survey. If it's not, then I'm sure you'll correct me. But some of the findings, particularly as it related to culture, were that 42% of leaders reported improved decision making. 86% of leaders reported better listening, 68% reported better clarity, and 93% reported being more innovative. I would say that's all those things are pretty positive impact on corporate culture.
Yes, absolutely. And so needed today. We've done over, I think we're approaching 100,000 surveys within our product. And we ask people about, like, are these practices helping you with specific goals? So all of our training programs are goal-based, and things like, reduce daily stress, calm anxiety, connect authentically, deepen relationships, manage back pain, improve insomnia, and so forth. And so these specific techniques, these different forms of practices done on a regular basis, we want to know, is it working? So I think on average across the board, we average 93%, and the full range is somewhere between 86 and 97%. That's how we optimize the training. And again, bite-sized practices that you can repeat, easy to learn and easy to repeat, to create new routines in your life is what creates those kind of results.
Yes. And I mean, obviously you're getting the right feedback back. All right, I'm gonna attempt to wrap things up here. I think we touched on a lot of things, skimmed the surface on others. Is there anything about mindfulness we didn't mention that you think it's important to bring in the discussion?
I do. It's like when we do we have a half-day live training event called Creating Mindful Leaders. It's a workshop. It's what the book is based on. And we end that with kind of a call to action. And so for your listener, I would share that call to action. And that is, what we learned together is we're training our brains all the time, right? So why not be intentional about it? We're training ourselves either to be happy, healthy, focused, and engaged, or the exact opposite, right? And whatever we're training ourselves, guess what? We're getting better and better at it as time goes by. So I like to end these workshops with a call to action. It's a famous saying, to have the things in life that other people do not have, you must be willing to do the things in life that other people won't do. And for me, that came down to 5 or 10 minutes a day of a mindfulness practice. And whether that's meditation or journaling or learning these mindful listening and conversation techniques, learning to regulate your central nervous system, all of these many, many techniques, find the ones that are right for you and get started. It's a little by little, you can address the things in your life to get back to the things you love most and get back to the person you want to be.
Sounds like a fair trade. Besides what I would think is pretty data intensive in terms of materials that you've provided in your book, what other materials or resources would you point interested people toward? Maybe I don't know if there's programs from Whil, anything that you mentioned, I'm going to add to the show notes. So anything come to mind?
Absolutely. So we, when it comes to Whil, we're WHIL.com. You can find plenty of free materials on ebooks. What is mindfulness, and how does it work? The competitive advantage of emotional intelligence. So we've got all these free educational ebooks that are great for professionals. We tour and do our Creating Mindful Leaders workshop, so you can find out and sign up in a city near you for folks who are in HR, leadership and development, and so forth. We also provide ongoing continuing education credits there, and we have monthly webcasts on different topics. We're always featuring top experts in their field on things like managing insomnia, back pain, safety, mindfulness, emotional intelligence skills, you name it. And so start there. My new book, Creating Mindful Leaders, is available online everywhere, and has been a big hit with our clients. Beyond that, I think you can find plenty of tools online to get started. And whether you want to do this on your own, I'd say find a great app to get started. If you want to do this for your organization, Whil's number one in the world at serving organizations and helping employees do this. And that's I think that gives you a handful of things to tap into.
That's a great list. And what about you? Where do people find you? Do you want to be found on social media elsewhere? I noticed that you presented a lot of conferences. Maybe there's a calendar someplace that people could find you if they want.
Yeah, this is how I spend most of my time. Like I did 24 keynotes last year, so I traveled the world talking about disruption, mindfulness, emotional intelligence. So you can find where I'm speaking on Whil.com as well. And if anyone's interested in booking us for your companies, we would be happy to do that. We got a 68 NPS score, which is pretty good. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're known for is really, we didn't get a lot into this today, but we kind of make stress and resilience fun, right? We get people laughing, nodding their heads about the crazy things that happen inside of big companies. And then from there, we go right into the techniques that they can learn in our workshops, through our books, and so forth. So if that's of interest, anyone can ping me at Joe, Joe at Whil.com, or you can find me at Joe W. Burton, Burton, on Twitter.
Joe, that's a conclusion. Thanks very much. This is a really far-reaching topic, and talking with you about it, I think, has been very valuable. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
It's my pleasure, and thanks everyone for their attention.
This has been Intangibles. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd like to thank VC Careers for their support, and I'd also like to thank Ben Gloway, who's a fantastic sound engineer. It is a privilege to work with him. Find him on Twitter. His handle is @visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve BERG.